Chapter 20.
Now Alma's sons went out to preach the word to the people. And Alma himself couldn't rest either, and he also went out. Now we won't say anything else about their preaching except they preached the word and truth according to the spirit of prophecy and revelation, and they preached according to the holy order of God by which they were called. And now I'll pick back up the account of the wars between the Nephite and Lamanite in the 18th year of the judge's rule mentioned earlier. The Zoramite became Lamanite. Therefore, at the start of the 18th year, the Nephites saw the Lamanite were coming to attack them. So they made preparations for war, and they gathered their armies in the land of Jershon. And the Lamanite came with their thousands. They entered the land of Antionum, which was the land of the Zoramite, and a man by the name of Zarahemnah led them. Because the Amlecite, and of themselves had a more wicked and murderous disposition than the Lamanite, all the chief captains Zarahemnah appointed over the Lamanite were from the ranks of the Amlecite and Zoramite. He did this so he could inspire their hatred of the Nephite, to bring them under his control in order to accomplish his plan, which was to incite the Lamanite to be angry with the Nephite. He did this so he could seize great power over them, wanting power over the Nephite to enslave them, etc. Now the Nephite aim was to protect their lands and houses and their wives and children, to keep them out of the hands of their enemies, and to preserve their rights and privileges, and their liberty as well, so they could worship God according to their wishes. They knew if they fell into the hands of the Lamanite, they would kill anyone who worshipped God in spirit and in truth, the true and living God. They also knew of the Lamanite extreme hatred of their former Lamanite, who were the people of Anti-Nephi-Lehi, who were called Ammon's people. Those people refused to arm themselves. Indeed, they had made a covenant and they wouldn't break it. Therefore, if they fell into the hands of the Lamanite, they would be killed. And the Nephite wouldn't allow them to be killed, so they gave them land to live on. Ammon's people in return gave the Nephite a large part of their supplies to support their armies. And so the Nephite had to stand alone against the Lamanite, who were a mixture of Laman, Lemuel, Ishmael's sons, and all those who had defected from the Nephite, who were Amlecite, Zoramite, and the descendants of Noah's priests. Now those who had defected were almost as numerous as the Nephite were. And so the Nephite had to engage them in conflict, knowing many would die. And when the Lamanite armies had gathered in the land of Antionum, the Nephite armies were prepared to meet them in the land of Jershon. The leader of the Nephite, or the man who had been appointed to be the chief captain over them who would command all the Nephite armies, was named Moroni. And Moroni took on the entire command and management of their wars, and he was only 25 years old when he was appointed chief commander over the Nephite armies. He met the Lamanite at the border of Jershon. His people were armed with swords, scimitars, and a variety of other weapons. When the Lamanite armies advanced, they saw Moroni had prepared the Nephite with breastplates and arm shields and helmets to defend their heads, and they wore thick clothing. Zarahemnah's army wasn't prepared with any such things. They only had swords and scimitars, bows and arrows, and stones and slings, and they were naked except for an animal skin that was secured around their waists. Indeed, everyone was naked except for the Zoramite and Amlecite. Yet even they didn't have breastplates or shields, and therefore they were very afraid of the Nephite armies because of their armor, despite far outnumbering them. Now they didn't dare come against the Nephite at the border of Jershon. So they left the land of Antionum and traveled through the wilderness, winding through a route taking them to the head of the Sidon River, so they could come into the land of Manti and take control of the land, since they didn't think Moroni's armies would know where they had gone. But as soon as they had entered the wilderness, Moroni sent spies into the wilderness to watch their camp. And because Moroni also knew of Alma's prophecies, he sent some men to him, requesting him to ask the Lord where the Nephite armies should go to defend themselves against the Lamanite. And the Lord's word came to Alma. Alma informed Moroni's messengers that the Lamanite armies were on the march, taking a route through the wilderness so they could come over into the land of Manti, planning to begin an attack on the weaker part of the people. And those messengers delivered the message to Moroni. Now Moroni left part of his army in the land of Jershon, fearing some of the Lamanite might somehow enter that land and take the city, and took the remaining part of his army and marched over into the land of Manti. He had all the people in that region of the land come together to fight the Lamanite, to defend their lands and country, their rights and liberties. Therefore they were prepared for when the Lamanite would arrive. Moroni had his army conceal themselves in the valley near the bank of the Sidon River, which was to the west of the Sidon River in the wilderness. Moroni placed spies on all sides so he would know when the Lamanite army arrived. Now, since Moroni knew the Lamanite ultimate purpose was to kill the Nephite or to subjugate them and bring them into slavery, in order to establish a kingdom for themselves over the whole land, and since he also knew the Nephite only desire was to preserve their lands, liberty, and congregation, therefore he saw nothing wrong with using a military strategy against them. So he used his spies to find the route the Lamanite were going to take. He divided his army and brought a part of it over into the valley and concealed them to the east and to the south of the hill Riplah. And the rest he concealed in the valley toward the west, to the west of the Sidon River, and through the area bordering the land of Manti. Then, having placed his army according to his plan, he was prepared to meet them. The Lamanite approached on the north side of the hill, where part of Moroni's army was hiding. When the Lamanite had passed the hill Riplah and entered the valley and began to cross the Sidon River, the army that was hiding on the south side of the hill, led by a man named Lehi, came out and surrounded the Lamanite on the east from behind. Then the Lamanite, when they saw the Nephite coming toward them from behind, turned around and began to fight Lehi's army. And the killing began on both sides, but it was more dreadful on the part of the Lamanite, since their naked bodies were exposed to the heavy blows of the Nephite with their swords and scimitars, which killed with almost every stroke. On the other hand, men occasionally fell among the Nephite from wounds and blood loss, since they were shielded on the more vital parts of the body from the strokes of the Lamanite by their breastplates, arm shields, and helmets. And so the Nephite continued killing the Lamanite. The Lamanite became frightened because of their great slaughter, which reached a point that they began to flee toward the Sidon River. And they were pursued by Lehi and his men. They were driven by Lehi into the Sidon River, and they crossed it. But Lehi stopped his armies at the bank of the Sidon River, and they didn't cross it. Then Moroni and his army met the Lamanite army in the valley, on the other side of the Sidon River. Moroni and his army began to attack and kill them. Then the Lamanite fled again before them toward the land of Manti, and they were met again by Moroni's armies. Now in this instance, the Lamanite fought fiercely. Indeed, the Lamanite had never been known to fight with such great strength and courage, not even from the beginning. They were inspired by the Zoramite and Amlacite, who were their chief captains and leaders, and by Zarahemnah, who was their chief captain, or their chief leader and commander. Indeed, they fought ferociously, like true warriors. And many of the Nephite were killed, since they broke many of their helmets in two and pierced many of their breastplates, and cut off many of their arms. So the Lamanite fought in their fury. Nevertheless, the Nephite were inspired by a better cause. They weren't fighting for monarchy or power, but they were fighting for their homes and liberty, their wives and children, and their way of life, indeed, for their rights of worship and their congregation. They were doing what they believed to be the duty owed to God, because the Lord had said to them and their forefathers that insofar as you aren't guilty of the first offense or the second, you must not allow yourselves to be killed by your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord said that you must defend your families even to the point of shedding blood. Therefore, for this reason, the Nephite were fighting the Lamanite, to defend themselves and their families and lands, their country and rights and religion. When Moroni's men saw the Lamanite fury and anger, they were about to retreat and flee from them. But Moroni, recognizing their fear, reminded and inspired them with this rally cry: "Remember your lands, your liberty, and your freedom from slavery." And they turned toward the Lamanite and they cried out in unison to the Lord their God for their liberty and their freedom from slavery. And they held their position against the Lamanite with renewed determination. In the very same hour they cried out to the Lord for their freedom, the Lamanite began to flee before them, and they went back all the way to the Sidon River. Now the Lamanite outnumbered the Nephite by more than double their number. Yet despite that, they were forced back into one compact group in the valley, on the bank by the Sidon River. So Moroni's armies surrounded them, on both sides of the river, with Lehi's men to the east. Therefore when Zarahemnah saw Lehi's men to the east of the Sidon River and Moroni's armies to the west of the river, that they were surrounded by the Nephite, they were terrified. Now Moroni, when he saw their terror, ordered his men to stop killing them. So they stopped and withdrew a pace from them, and then Moroni said to Zarahemnah, "You can see, Zarahemnah, we don't want to be killers. You know that you are in our hands, yet we don't want to kill you. We haven't come out to battle against you to shed your blood to get power. And we don't want to impose slavery on anyone either. Yet this is the very reason you've come against us, and you're angry with us because of our religion. But now you see with your eyes that the Lord is with us. And you see He's delivered you into our hands. Now I want you to understand this is accomplished by us because of our religion and our faith in Christ. Now you see you can't destroy this faith of ours. You should realize this is the true faith of God. Indeed, you see God will support, watch over, and preserve us so long as we're faithful to Him and to our faith and religion. The Lord will never allow us to be destroyed unless we fall into transgression and deny our faith. Now, Zarahemnah, I command you in the name of that all-powerful God who has strengthened our arms to give us power over you by our faith, by our religion and rites of worship and congregation, and by the sacred support we owe our wives and children, and by the liberty that binds us to our lands and country, and also by the upholding of God's sacred word, to which we owe all our happiness, and by all that is most dear to us. Furthermore, I command you by all your desire to live to give up your weapons to us, and we'll stop the fight, and we'll spare your lives if you go your way and don't come against us to war again. Now if you don't do this, you are in our hands. And I'll order my men to attack you and continue killing all of you with mortal wounds. And then we'll see who will have power over us. We'll see who will be sent into slavery." When Zarahemnah had heard these words, he came forward and gave up his sword, scimitar, and bowed to Moroni and said to him, "Here are our weapons, we'll hand them over to you. But we won't agree to make an oath to you that we know we'll break, and our children as well. However, take our weapons and allow us to go away into the wilderness. Otherwise, we'll keep our swords, and we'll die or conquer. We're not of your faith. We don't believe it's God who's delivered us into your hands. But we believe it's your clever precautions that have kept you safe from our swords, it's your breastplates and shields that have kept you alive." When Zarahemnah had finished saying this, Moroni gave the sword and weapons he had received back to Zarahemnah, saying, "We'll continue the conflict until the end. Now I won't renew the offer I've made. Therefore, as the Lord lives, you shall not leave this place unless you leave with an oath that you won't come back against us to war. Now as you're in our hands, we'll spill your blood on the ground, or you'll submit to the conditions I've proposed." When Moroni had said these words, Zarahemnah held onto his sword. And being angry with Moroni, he rushed forward to kill him. But as he raised his sword, one of Moroni's soldiers struck it right to the ground, and it broke at the hilt. He also struck Zarahemnah, so that he severed his scalp and it fell to the ground. And Zarahemnah retreated into the middle of his soldiers. And the soldier who stood by, who cut off Zarahemnah's scalp, raised the scalp from the ground by the hair and placed it on the point of his sword and held it out to them, declaring to them in a loud voice, "Just as this scalp has fallen to the ground, which is your leader's scalp, so also will you fall to the ground unless you hand over your weapons and leave with a covenant of peace." Now there were many, when they heard these words and saw the scalp on the sword, who suddenly became afraid. So many came forward and threw down their weapons at Moroni's feet and made a covenant of peace. And they allowed all those who made a covenant to go away into the wilderness. Now Zerahemnah was furious, and he incited anger in the rest of his soldiers to fight the Nephite more fiercely. Moroni was angry because of the Lamanites' stubbornness. Therefore he ordered his people to attack them and kill them. So they began to kill them. And the Lamanite fought with their swords and with their strength. But their naked skin and bare heads were exposed to the Nephites' sharp swords. Indeed, they were stabbed and slashed, and they fell very quickly before the Nephite swords. They began to be swept down, just as Moroni's soldier had prophesied. Now Zerahemnah, when he saw that they were all about to die, cried out loudly to Moroni, promising if they spared the lives of the rest of them that he and his people would covenant with them never to return to war against them. And so Moroni again stopped the killing. And he took the Lamanite weapons from them. After they had made a covenant of peace with him, they were allowed to go away into the wilderness. Now their dead weren't counted because of how many there were. Unfortunately, the number of their dead was terribly high, on the part of both the Nephite and the Lamanite. They threw their dead into the Sidon River, and they've gone downstream and are buried in the depths of the sea. The armies of the Nephite led by Moroni went back to their houses and lands. And so ended the 18th year of the judges' rule over the Nephite. That ends Alma's record, which was written on the plates of Nephi.